For decades, scientists assumed they already understood the story of ancient China. A population arose, a civilization formed, and history moved forward in a more or less straight line. Clean, contained, settled. Then the Dina came back, and nothing was clean anymore. When researchers began systematically comparing the genetic signatures buried inside ancient Chinese remains against the genomic fingerprints of every major ancient civilization on Earth, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Indus Valley, Minoan, Phoenician, Anatolian, they expected to find a familiar portrait, a people who were genetically isolated, self-contained, a story that began and ended within the borders of East Asia. Instead, they found a match. One specific match. One civilization, out of all the great cultures of the ancient world, whose population showed a pattern of shared ancestry, overlapping haplogroups, and genomic markers that crossed the boundary of what conventional history said was possible. And the implications did not stay contained to a laboratory. This is not a story about one study, or one genome, or one controversial paper published and quickly forgotten. This is about what happens when the most powerful tool humanity has ever used to read the past, ancient Dina, is turned toward the oldest questions of all. Where did we really come from? Who were we connected to? And what has the official narrative of ancient civilization been quietly missing for a very long time? The answer, it turns out, was buried in the bones. The story of ancient China, as most of the world learned it, begins around the Yellow River. The Huaxia people. The legendary emperors, an unbroken culture stretching back more than 5,000 years, with its own writing, its own agricultural revolution, its own mythologies and cosmologies arising independently from the civilizations forming in the ancient Near East or along the Mediterranean coast. This narrative of parallel development, the idea that China and the Western civilizations grew in isolation from one another, separated by the vast deserts of Central Asia and the towering ranges of the Himalayas, became the foundational assumption of both Eastern and Western archaeology for most of the 20th century. The Silk Road, scholars insisted, was a relatively late development. Meaningful contact between China and the distant civilizations of the Mediterranean or the Middle East was not possible in the deep prehistoric period. There were always anomalies that didn't quite fit this picture. Bronze working techniques that appeared in China and the Near East with suspicious simultaneity. Mythological motifs that seemed to rhyme across impossible distances. The mysterious Tarim Basin mummies, dug from the deserts of western China and dated to between 2000 and 500 BC, whose features, woolen textiles, and genomic markers pointed not to East Asia but to a population closely related to ancient Western Eurasians. But anomalies can be set aside, explained away, reframed as coincidence. For a long time, they were. What changed was not the anomalies. What changed was the technology used to read them. Ancient DNA analysis, the science of extracting, sequencing, and comparing genetic material from human remains thousands of years old, barely existed as a functional discipline before the early 2000s. The technical challenges were immense. Ancient bone degrades. DNA breaks apart. Contamination from modern DNA was, for years, an almost unsolvable problem. But by the 2010s, the field had transformed. New laboratory methods allowed researchers to sequence ancient genomes with a level of accuracy that was previously unimaginable. Researchers could now extract meaningful genetic data from remains that were 3,000, 5,000, even 10,000 years old, and they could compare those ancient genomes against one another with statistical precision, tracking migration events, admixture events, and population replacements across continents and millennia. The ancient DNA revolution rewrote the history of Europe almost overnight. It revealed that the people who built Stonehenge were largely replaced by incoming populations from the Pontic Steppe. It showed that ancient Europeans were a layered composite of at least 3 major ancestral populations whose mixtures had been invisible to archaeology. It overturned assumptions about the Indo-European migrations, the spread of agriculture, the origins of Bronze Age cultures from Ireland to India. Scientists working on ancient Chinese genomes were watching all of this unfold, and they began asking a question that, given the new tools available to them, suddenly seemed answerable. What did the genetic landscape of prehistoric and ancient China actually look like when you read it at this level of resolution? And how did it compare to what was happening on the other side of the ancient world? When they ran those comparisons, methodically, systematically, against every major ancient population, one result came back different from all the others. The civilization that showed the strongest genetic affinity with specific ancient populations in China was not what most researchers expected. It was not the Egyptians, despite centuries of romantic speculation about Egyptian influence across the ancient world. It was not the Mesopotamians, despite the fact that both Mesopotamian and Chinese civilization were early centers of urban development and writing. It was not the Phoenicians or the Greeks. The most statistically significant shared ancestry signals, when researchers examined ancient genomic data from Bronze Age populations across Eurasia, pointed toward populations associated with the ancient Yamnaya culture and their descendants, the same steppe pastoralist groups who had already been shown to have transformed prehistoric Europe and South Asia. But more specifically, within the ancient Chinese record, the traces of genetic exchange pointed toward populations archaeologists associate with the Bronze Age cultures of the Western Eurasian steppe, a vast corridor of grassland stretching from the Pontic region north of the Black Sea all the way toward the borders of ancient China through modern Kazakhstan and the Altai region. These were not marginal or peripheral populations. Their descendants founded or heavily influenced some of the ancient world's most powerful civilizations. Their genomic signature, carried in specific haplogroups, particularly Y chromosome haplogroup R1a and its associated mitochondrial lineages, appeared in ancient remains across Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, and now, with increasing clarity, in early Bronze Age remains from the edges of what would become historical China. What this meant was significant. The genetic boundary between what we call East and West in the deep prehistoric past was not a wall, it was a gradient. And at the edges of that gradient, populations were moving, mixing, and exchanging far earlier than conventional history had allowed. The Tarim Basin mummies, once treated as an inexplicable anomaly, were now a data point in a much larger pattern. They were not mysterious outsiders. They were evidence of a population continuum that stretched across the ancient steppe world, a world that Chinese civilization, in its formative centuries, was not isolated from. Here is where the story gets complicated in a way that goes beyond genetics. National identity, in both East Asia and the Western world, is entangled with history in ways that make genomic revisions feel threatening. The idea of Chinese civilization as a uniquely self-generated, uninterrupted, internally driven phenomenon is not merely an academic position. It is a deeply held cultural and political conviction. The narrative of continuous, unbroken civilization rooted in the Yellow River Basin for 5 millennia is foundational to how Chinese history is taught, interpreted, and understood. To suggest that the populations who contributed to early Chinese civilization shared significant genetic ancestry with Bronze Age steppe pastoralists, people who were also ancestral to ancient Europeans and South Asians, is not, to a scientist, a politically loaded claim. It is a genomic observation. It is data. But data does not exist in a cultural vacuum. Geneticists working in this space have consistently emphasized what these findings do not mean. They do not mean that Chinese civilization was invented or imported from the West. They do not mean that the cultural achievements of ancient China, its writing, its bronze casting, its philosophy, its art, were somehow borrowed from somewhere else. Complex cultures arise through processes far more nuanced than genetics alone can capture. and the populations whose genes flowed into ancient East Asia were transformed by and contributors to something distinctly their own. What the genetics does challenge is the model of total isolation. The model that said the populations of ancient China and the ancient Western world had nothing to do with one another before the Silk Road made formal contact possible. That model, the genomic data now strongly suggests, was always incomplete. Pull back from the specific findings, and a larger picture comes into focus. The ancient world was far more connected than the civilizations it produced wanted to believe about themselves. Populations moved across Central Asia not just in the historical period, but in the Deep Bronze Age and possibly before. They carried genes, and with those genes, they almost certainly carried technologies, languages, animals, pathogens, and ideas. The wheel, the domesticated horse, certain metallurgical techniques, and possibly elements of Proto-Indo-European language itself moved across the steppe world in patterns now visible in ancient Dina. This is not a story unique to China. It is the story the ancient Dina revolution keeps telling, no matter where researchers look. The ancient world was not a collection of sealed containers, each producing its own civilization in glorious independence. It was a web. An interconnected, constantly shifting network of populations whose movements left traces that only now, with the tools of modern genomics, are becoming legible. What makes the Chinese case particularly striking is the scale of what was hidden. China represents the longest continuous written historical record of any civilization on Earth. Its history has been studied, debated, and documented for millennia. And yet the genetic story of its formative population history, who the people of early China were, where their ancestors came from, who they shared ancestry with across the ancient world, was essentially invisible until sequences started coming back from ancient remains. The oldest question in human history has always been, where do we come from? Philosophers asked it. Priests answered it. Emperors codified the answers into founding myths. And now, scientists are reading the actual answer out of 3,000-year-old bones pulled from the earth, and finding that the true answer is always more interconnected, more surprising, and more human than any founding myth was ever designed to allow. Responsible storytelling about ancient Dina requires honesty about what the science has not yet resolved. The field of ancient East Asian genomics is younger than its European counterpart. The sample sizes from ancient Chinese sites, while growing rapidly, are still far smaller than researchers would like. Many regions of China, particularly the heartland of early Chinese civilization in the Central Plains, remain undersampled in the ancient Dina record. The picture being constructed is real, but it is still incomplete, and responsible scientists are the first to acknowledge that. The specific nature of the population contacts, exactly when they occurred, exactly how significant the genetic contribution was to the populations that became historical Chinese civilization, exactly which cultural or technological exchanges accompanied the movement of genes, these are questions that remain actively debated. Different research groups have reached somewhat different conclusions based on different sampling strategies and different analytical methods. The field is moving quickly, and the picture continues to be refined. What is not in serious doubt is the fundamental finding: the ancient populations of East Asia were not genetically isolated from the rest of the ancient world in the way the standard historical model assumed. There were deep prehistorical connections, most likely mediated through the populations of the Eurasian steppe, that left a measurable imprint on the genomic landscape of ancient China. The specific single civilization that fits the match most precisely will continue to be refined by future discoveries. But the match itself, the genetic echo of a world more connected than we imagined, grows clearer with every new sample sequenced from every new ancient site. There is something quietly profound about what this science reveals, not just about ancient China, but about the nature of civilization itself. We have always told the story of human history as a story of separation: East and West, Old World and New World. One culture here, another there, each arising from its own soil, its own genius, its own unbroken thread of identity stretching back to some mythologized point of origin. These stories are compelling. They give people roots. They give nations meaning. They are not nothing. But they have never been exactly true. The bones knew. The DNA knew. The genetic record has always carried the real story inside it. The story of a species that has never stopped moving, never stopped mixing, never stopped reaching across mountains and deserts and seas to touch the other side of the world. The match that scientists found between ancient Chinese populations and one specific ancient civilization is not, at its deepest level, a story about genetics or archaeology or academic controversy. It is a story about what human beings have always done. We move, we meet, we merge. We build something new from what we carry and what we find. And then we tell our children that we always belonged exactly where we are, that our civilization rose from the earth beneath our feet, as if it had no other origin. The DNA says otherwise. It says we are all, in the deepest biological sense, the descendants of encounters across impossible distances, that the borders we draw in history books were never as solid as we drew them, that the ancient world was already a conversation long before anyone built a road, or wrote a letter, or named a civilization. And the most powerful thing about that truth is not that it divides us from the past we thought we had. It is that it reveals a past far more connected, far more alive, and far more shared than we were ever told to expect. The scientists matched the DNA. They found the fit, and what they found was not one civilization's secret origin. It was a reminder that civilization itself, all of it, everywhere, has always been a story written together.